Alright, so like I mentioned at the end of the last video, this is your chance to listen to some real music. Pull out your headphones, or if you're in your dorm, turn your speakers on. First thing that we're going to look at is from Mozart's Jupiter Symphony, his last symphony, number 41, from the last movement. So, go take a listen to Mozart Jupiter, and then come back. I assume you're pausing the video. Okay, so you probably noticed that this one goes by really quickly. If you look at the textural reduction here in the book, you'll also notice that it's only 3 voices. We don't have a 4-voice texture, just a 3-voice texture. But the implication is pretty clear that we have a tonic in measure 1, a predominant in measure 2, a dominant in measure 3, and then a deceptive resolution in measure 4. That predominant in measure 2 is one of these new supertonic 7th chords that we've been talking about. This case, like I was mentioning last time, 2-7 occurs most often in inversion, and this is one of those examples where we move from tonic in first inversion to 2 with 7th also in first inversion. That chord in root position would have a D, an F, an A, and a C. Now, since it's only in 3 voices, we have to leave out one of the voices, even though it's in inversion. We can't have a complete chord because we don't have enough voices. And so Mozart left out the 5th. That's totally fine. What's great about this excerpt is that even though he's left out a voice, the C, which is the 7th there in the second violin, does actually resolve downward, just like we talked about. The 7th is almost always going to resolve down. You see in the next example from Clara Schumann, go listen. We can see in the next example that we have this lovely descending motion in the bass. Again, this one is a little easier to see in the textural reduction that's at the bottom of that page. We get a 4 chord, then its 7th is added, stepping downward, to a 2 chord. Remember I talked about in the previous video that within the predominant realm we can move from one predominant to another. So she's moved from 4 to 2, and then she goes to 5, but not before adding a 7th to that 2 chord as well. So we get a 4-7, and then a 2-7, and then finally a 5-7, except all of these chords are in inversion. Both of the predominant 7th chords are in 3rd inversion. This dominant 7th chord is in 1st inversion. All sorts of interesting things going on there. It's a really, really beautiful excerpt from Clara Schumann there. And then lastly, we have a really challenging one. So I'd encourage you, listen to this at least once. Make sure you listen to it at least once with the score in front of you. This is Dvorak's New World Symphony, right at the very beginning of the symphony from Movement 1. Go listen to that for a second. Okay, so first of all, this is a challenging excerpt because all 3 voices pose problems. First of all, double bass sounds an octave lower than is written. So that E written in the double bass above the bass clef actually sounds the E on the bass clef, as you can see from the textural reduction. The cellos are in tenor clef, which most of us aren't totally comfortable reading, and the violas are in alto clef, which most of us aren't comfortable reading. The other challenge, of course, is that it's not immediately apparent, but the cellos are actually above the violas. So it's basses, then violas, then cellos with the melody on top of that. So, a complicated thing to deal with. the easiest thing to do probably is to look at the textural reduction underneath to make sense of all of it. There's a sequential motion in the first two bars, and you can read what the authors say about this example here on page 220. Basically what's going on, there's a sequence. So we get the first measure is the first iteration of the sequence, a reiteration of the sequential material in measure 2, and then we get sort of a cadential gesture at the end. Now, the authors suggest that the 2 half diminished 6/5, remember we're in the minor mode, and so 2 with 7th is half diminished in minor, that this 2 half diminished 6/5 is substituting for a 4 chord, a subdominant chord, and in that case this is kind of like a plagal cadence. And I sort of buy that. I certainly hear this as being plagal, from 1 to 4 to 1, or something like a 4 chord. So they say that maybe this 2 chord is substituting for a 4 chord. The problem is that if that's the case, this 2 chord, first of all, it doesn't do what a 2 chord is supposed to do. A 2 chord is supposed to go to 5, because 2 is a predominant. And because of that, the 7th of this 2/7, which is E, remember we're in the key of E major, so a 2/7 would be F sharp, A, C, and E. That's half diminished. The E of that 2/7 should resolve downward by step. But if it does, it's not a chord member of the following chord. And so that E actually just sticks around. You can sort of sing it along with the excerpt, that final cadence. Here's your E. That E just sort of gets stuck. It's a 7th that doesn't resolve. So I would suggest that they're closer with their suggestion that it's a 4 chord simply with an added 6th there. And I would even go so far as to say that the F sharp in that chord, the notes here are F sharp, A, C, and E, remember. The F sharp is not actually a chord member. And if it's not a chord member, then this makes sense. If F sharp is not a chord member, the notes are A, C, and E. This is just an A minor chord, which is subdominant. It's 4 in E minor. So then we simply have 1 to 4 to 1. So what's F sharp doing there? Well, if you look closely, and it's easier to see if you look at it in the real score, in the viola part. It's the top viola part. The violas move G to F sharp and back to G. I don't know about you, but to me, that looks like a lower neighbor. So we get a lower neighbor to this G at the same time as we have, oh, I bet that was ridiculously loud. Sorry, I bumped the pedal. We get a lower neighbor G, F sharp, G, at the same time as we have a plagal motion. So if you listen, you'll hear G, F sharp, G, as a lower neighbor to that voice. And then this plagal motion makes more sense. So there's a couple examples, 3 examples, of some supertonic chords in the wild, doing what they do, which is going to 5 for the most part, except when they're used in an unusual fashion like in this Dvorak example. Next we're going to turn to the leading tone 7th chord, and this one is a little bit unusual because it's different in major and minor. We'll talk about that. Hop on over to the next video whenever you're ready for some more.